The wind came first. That long, sighing breath that never seemed to stop out on the Wyoming plains. It carried dust, whispers, and sometimes the cries of things too tired to fight back. That evening, as the sun bled itself over the horizon, Clara May Hensley stood barefoot in the yard behind her shack, her cheek split, her lip trembling, her arms wrapped around the smallest of her 3 daughters. The baby's head fit into the hollow of her collarbone like something meant to hide. Behind her, a man's voice barked and cracked, words slurred with whiskey and hate. He'd called her cursed again. Cursed for giving him girls instead of the son. Cursed for breathing. Cursed for being too quiet when he wanted noise, too soft when he wanted fire. Inside, a chair toppled. Then silence. Then the slam of the door as he stumbled out into the dark. The neighbors heard, of course. The town always did. But nobody came. Not the midwife, not the sheriff, not the women who whispered in church pews with folded hands and bitten tongues. Because here, in this wind-beaten corner of the world, pain was private, and pity was a luxury reserved for the dead. Clara stayed outside until the stars came out, pale and far away. When she finally went in, she did not cry. She cleaned the blood from her face, hummed a lullaby, and prayed that in the morning he'd be too drunk to remember. But he never came home. 3 days later, they found Jonas Hensley face down by the river, thrown from his horse, neck snapped clean. The town buried him with little fuss. The women said things behind their palms. She'll manage now, poor thing. Maybe the Lord had his reasons. Maybe she did it herself. By the time the gossip reached her door, Clara was already outside, a shovel in her hands, digging her own patch of earth. She didn't ask the town for help. She didn't wait for prayers. She dug because she needed to, because her daughters were watching, and because work was the only thing that had ever answered her. The earth was dry, cracked, stubborn, like everything else here. She dug until her arms trembled, until sweat stung her open lip, until her knees gave way in the dust. Then a shadow fell across her. She looked up and saw a man, broad-shouldered, dust on his boots, a weather hat pulled low. His eyes were the color of river stones, steady, unstartled. He didn't speak for a while, just watched her, the shovel, the half-dug grave. When he finally did, his voice was rough, quiet, like gravel soaked in rain. You shouldn't have to do that alone. Clara's fingers clenched the handle. Don't need help. But he stepped forward anyway, took the shovel from her hands without another word, and began to dig. His movements were clean, practice, not out of pity but habit. A man who'd buried things before. When the hole was deep enough, he stopped, stood there with a shovel, like it was an old friend he didn't much like anymore. Then he said it, 5 words that would follow her for the rest of her life. You're coming with me. Not a command, not even a question, just a truth he'd already decided. Clara stared at him, at the lines on his face, the empty wedding band still clinging to his finger. Behind him, the plain stretched out like a promise too big to hold. She almost said no. Pride wanted her to. Fear begged her to. But her daughters were hungry, and the baby had begun to cry, and somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered, "This is what it feels like when mercy knocks." So she nodded once, just once, and when he turned toward his horse, she followed. His name was Elias Boone, a widowed rancher who lived 15 miles out, near the low hills where the sky leaned close enough to touch. His wife had died 5 years back in childbirth. Folks said he'd stopped speaking much after that, stopped smiling, stopped needing anyone. The house he brought them to was weathered but clean, 2 rooms, a big table, and the smell of pine and tobacco. Elias showed her the stove, the well, the bed she could take with the girls. Said little else. Didn't ask for thanks. Didn't offer comfort. Just fed his horses and went quiet again. Clara didn't know what to make of him, but the days began to form a rhythm, like beads on a rosary. Morning. Feed the chickens, patch the clothes, braid the girls' hair. Evening. Supper by lantern light. The creak of the windmill turning. The silence of 2 people who didn't yet know what to say. Elias spoke mostly with his hands, fixing a broken latch, setting a loaf of bread by the door, leaving an apple on the table for the girls. Clara began to understand him the way you understand rain. Not by words, but by how it feels when it finally falls after too long a drought. Sometimes she'd catch him watching her as she hummed to the baby. Sometimes she'd watch him out by the corral, his hand gentle on a horse's muzzle. Neither looked away too quickly, but the town noticed. When Clara rode into town for flour, the whispers followed her like shadows. Widower Boone's got himself a housekeeper, or maybe a bed warmer. She moves quick, don't she? The shame clung to her skin all the way home. That night, as Elias sat by the stove mending a bridle, she stood by the door, trembling. "They're saying things," she whispered. "Ugly things." He looked up, slow and steady. "Let them talk. They've never worked a day for what peace costs." Something in his tone, the finality of it, loosened the knot in her chest. She turned away, and he went back to mending, but the silence that followed was softer than before. One night, the wind changed. It carried smoke. By the time Elias smelled it, the barn was already half fire, half night. The horses screamed, metal hissed. He ran without thinking, bare-armed, shouting for water, for help. None came. The nearest neighbor was miles off. Clara burst from the house, the baby in her arms, her daughters crying behind her. She saw the fire rip through the roof like a live thing. Elias was inside, trying to free the horses. Without hesitation, she thrust the baby into Abigail's arms and ran straight into the blaze. The heat clawed her throat, her skirt catching sparks, but she found him, struggling under a fallen beam, eyes wild with smoke. Together they pushed, heaving until the weight gave way. "Get out!" he shouted, coughing hard. But she stayed until the last horse bolted free. Only when the roof groaned above them did she pull him out into the night. The barn collapsed behind them with a sound like thunder. They fell into the dirt, coughing, shaking. The air smelled of ash and survival. Elias looked at her. Her hair blackened with soot, her hands blistered, her face streaked with tears and smoke. "You could have run," he rasped. She looked at him, voice quiet as dawn. "I already did once. Didn't get me far." He stared at her for a long moment, and in that silence, something shifted, something old and heavy that neither of them had words for. When morning came, the barn was gone. Only the stone foundation remained, warm to the touch. Clara planted wildflowers there weeks later. Said it was better to fill ashes with life than with memory. The town stopped whispering after that. Maybe they'd run out of cruel stories, or maybe they'd seen the way Elias looked at Clara now, not with pity, but with the quiet awe of a man who'd found something unbreakable. Clara began to stand taller in town. She smiled at the midwife. She bought candy for the girls. She didn't hide her hands anymore, though the burns still showed. Elias built her a new barn. Didn't say much as he worked. But when he hung the lantern by the door and wiped the sawdust from his palms, he glanced her way, and she nodded, a nod that meant more than a lifetime of words. Their hands brushed once while feeding the horses. Neither pulled away. At night, when the children slept, they sat outside under the wide sweep of stars, listening to the wind slide through the grass. The same wind that had once carried her husband's curses now only carried peace. Years later, folks passing through would sometimes ask who lived in that ranch by the hills. And some would say, "That's Elias Boone and Clara May. Hard people, good people. They built everything back from nothing." But those who'd been there from the start, those who remembered the night the wind carried smoke, they said it softer. No, she built him back too. If you were to ride by that land today, you'd see a little patch of wildflowers where the barn once stood, yellow, blue, white, nodding in the breeze. You'd see 3 young women laughing by the fence, and a woman in a faded dress watching them with quiet pride. And if you looked close enough, you'd see the rancher beside her, hat low, eyes steady, as though the years had finally taught him that not all things worth keeping need to be spoken out loud. And maybe that's the secret of the West, that it wasn't built on gold or guns, but on the stubborn mercy of those who stayed when it would have been easier to walk away. Because every mile of that country still remembers her name, and every time the wind moves through the grass, it sounds a little like forgiveness, and a little like love,